Good morning and welcome to day 20 of our 21 day series. Tomorrow is the last day, and how quickly these 3 weeks have gone by. Today, we're going to talk about fear, anxiety, and phobias. There's a difference between fear and anxiety, although people oftentimes confuse the two. Historically, the difference between fear and anxiety has been whether or not there's an obvious source of danger. Fear is, I am afraid of, fill in the blank. Anxiety, the feared object or situation is rather amorphous. It's ephemeral. It's not there. I am anxious about, fill in the blank. So fear is a basic emotion that triggers the fight or flight response. It is nearly instantaneous, and it allows us to escape if that's the best thing for us to do. Fear in the absence of stimuli is referred to as panic. Many people have had a panic attack. It's similar to a state of fear and often includes an impending sense of doom. Everybody I've ever spoken to who had a panic attack said, Dr. Bragg, I thought I was going to die. So that's a big feature of a panic attack. Now, having a panic attack or two or three panic attacks, so long as they're not close together, is not panic disorder. Many people can have a panic attack and be perfectly fine. Matter of fact, in some situations, panic is an appropriate emotion. But Psalms 56, verse 3 and 4 says, Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? Fear and panic both have three components. The components of fear are a cognitive, I think that. It's a physiological, such as an increased heart rate, and it can be behavior in having that strong urge to either flee or fight. Anxiety is a response to a complex blend of unpleasant emotions and cognitions that are rather diffuse and future oriented. It also has three components: the cognitive or subjective. This is a negative mood or worry about future threats. It could be a self preoccupation, perhaps the inability to predict the future threat or control it if it happens. Remember, I've said over and over again, we don't like being out of control. The behavioral component of anxiety is to generally avoid the anxiety producing situation. And there is no activation of the fight or flight response. Anxiety may very well be adaptive because it helps us plan for possible threats in a mild to moderate degree. It enhances our learning and performance. Philippians 4 verses 6 and 7 says this: Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind through Jesus Christ. So, what then are the anxiety disorders? They are the most common disorders. When I was talking the other day about disorders in general, I made that statement. Anxieties disorders are the most common, followed by depression. Anxiety is the most common disorder that's diagnosed in women, and comorbidity is typical. Now, if you don't know what comorbidity is, it means that there is something else that goes along with it. So you might have anxiety and depression. So it's a fancy word, but it just means goes along with. The causes of anxiety, there seems to be a genetic vulnerability. People who rate high in neuroticism, that doesn't mean they're neurotic, it means they have neurotic traits. Um, the limbic system seems to be involved. The limbic system controls our emotion. There are some neurotransmitters that are activated by anxiety: GABA, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And we learn anxiety through classical conditioning. We talked about learning, oh gee whiz, right at the beginning of this series. So if you remember classical conditioning, and then if you have an external locus of control, that is, if you think that the world and the environment controls you rather than you being able to control your environment, that's an external locus of control. Anxiety is fairly easily treated through graduated exposure. That's the most effective treatment. We can use cognitive restructuring, where we help people think differently about the anxiety producing events. And then medication, benzodiazepines and antidepressants seems to be fairly effective. Now, the problem with benzodiazepines is there's some fairly significant side effects to benzos. So, the types of anxiety disorder, now we talked about panic disorder. Panic disorder is a discrete period of intense fear or discomfort with the absence of real danger. Now, panic disorder is repetitive panic attacks, not a single event. The first occurrence of a panic attack is usually after a very high stressful life circumstance. Some research tells us that 80 to 90% of people will report their first panic attack after one or more negative life events. About a quarter of adults will experience a panic attack without developing panic disorder. So if you're saying, oh, Lord have mercy, Dr. Bragg's talking about panic attacks and I have them, that does not mean that you have panic disorder. Roughly 1 in 4 people will experience at least one panic attack without developing the disorder. General anxiety disorder is a pretty tough one. It's pretty pervasive. It's excessive worry and anxiety more days than not for at least 6 months about many different activities. The worry is very difficult to control, and it's about everything. It's not about something, it's about everything. Anxiety and worry are associated with 3 of these symptoms: a restlessness or feeling keyed up on edge, being easily fatigued, having difficulty concentrating or your mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, and possibly even sleep disturbance. Hoarding disorder is a new addition to the DSM-5. It's persistent difficulty in discarding or parting with possessions because of a perceived need to save them. There's even TV shows about people who are hoarders. A person who is experiencing hoarding disorder has a high level of distress at the very thought of getting rid of items. There is an excessive accumulation of items regardless of the real value. Hoarding will create cramped living conditions such that homes may be filled to capacity with only narrow pathways winding through the clutter. Many years ago, before I became a psychologist, I sold insurance. And one of my clients, I didn't know it at the time, I just thought these people were really weird. But these people were hoarders. They saved magazines and newspapers, and from the very front door to the very back door, and all spaces were stacked to the ceiling with newspapers and magazines, and there were spaces just about wide enough for you to walk through the center of the house, and then pathways went off to the bedrooms and the restrooms and so forth. And it was truly unpleasant. Because of the hoarding of papers, they had roaches that had infested the house, and you could smell the roaches. It was horrific. I don't know how the people lived in such conditions, but every now and again, because they were my clients, I had to go see them, and I dreaded having to go to that house that was full of newspaper. God forbid that there would ever be a fire, because that house would have been a tinderbox. Trichotillomania, that's one of my favorite mental illnesses to say. It just kind of rolls off the tongue. Trichotillomania, that's a recurrent and irresistible urge to pull hair from your scalp, your eyebrows, or other areas of the body, even though you want to stop, because when you pluck the hair, you release some of the anxiety. The hair pulling from the scalp will often leave bald, patchy spots, which causes significant distress because the people are ashamed, and it interferes with their social and work functioning. People with trichotillomania may even pull out individual eyelashes. So I've seen people who had trichotillomania that actually had no eyelashes because they pulled them out one at a time, and it releases tension. People with trichotillomania go through a lot of trouble trying to disguise their hair loss. That's anxiety. Now, the anxiety may go to the level of having a phobia. A phobia is a persistent and irrational fear of an object, activity, or situation. Typical symptoms include intense feelings of fear and anxiety to avoid the object, activity, or situation. It can be really, really tough to deal with. And if you name anything in the world, somebody has a phobia of it. It's that pervasive. They are the most common form of anxiety. And we believe that phobias are learned behavior due to some sort of a direct experience, typically tied to some sort of trauma. Sometimes it's developed through observational learning. You may remember when we talked about learning, I talked about social learning or observational learning, when somebody sees somebody else experience something, and based on the consequence of that behavior, they learn to do the same thing, or they learn to avoid it. There are things about us that actually support the development of a phobia, and that is our attention and memory. People that have a specific phobia tend to pay more attention to threatening information that relates to their fear. I once had a client that had a phobia of sharks. This young lady could not be in a room that was painted blue. Why? Because water is blue. And where do sharks live? Sharks live in the water. She couldn't take a bath because she would immerse her body in water. And where do sharks live? In water. You can see how irrational this is. When she showered, she had to keep her eyes open, which resulted in getting soap and shampoo in her eyes. But if she closed her eyes, she began to see visions of sharks. She lived in Virginia Beach, and if you're familiar with Virginia Beach, she wouldn't go any closer to the beach than Pacific Avenue. Why? Because the next street was Atlantic Avenue, and after Atlantic Avenue there was the beach, and after the beach there was the water. And where do sharks live? Sharks live in water. again, you can see how irrational this fear is. People with a phobia, they can't stand to even see pictures of the feared object. Arachnophobia is a fear of spiders. That's a very common fear, and a lot of people have heard that term. But somebody with arachnophobia can't even open a magazine that may have a picture of a spider. They will go absolutely bonkers. Our beliefs and interpretations also tend to support the phobias that we may have, because people that have a specific phobia tend to believe and interpret situation in a way that will increase their anxiety. We tend to avoid the phobic situation, and we engage in behaviors that will keep us out of the phobic situation. Now, interestingly enough, there's a biological connection here, because phobias may have a genetic cause and run in families. It's not that generationally they'll have the same phobia, but if grandma has a phobia, then mom will probably have a phobia, and so will the daughter and granddaughter. Um, it it's an interesting situation, but that ties into anxiety. You may remember I've said in the past that anxiety tends to be passed down genetically as well. So let's talk a little bit more about what phobias are specifically. A simple phobia is a marked and persistent fear that's unreasonable and excessive about a specific object or situation. Um, Sharks, spiders. The exposure to the phobic stimulus will almost always provoke an immediate anxiety response that may take the form of a panic attack. And interestingly enough, the person recognizes that the fear is excessive or unreasonable. The phobic situation is avoided or else endured only with great anxiety or distress, and the avoidance interferes with normal routines and occupations. Now, children can develop phobias, but in children, the anxiety may be expressed by crying, temper tantrums, freezing up, or clinging to an adult. Children may not realize that their fear is unreasonable. The diagnosis is only appropriate if avoidance, fear, and all the other things I talk about will interfere with the person's daily routine. I'm pausing here because I'm trying to determine whether or not I can talk about my wife. I'll do it. My wife is afraid of fire. She is so afraid of fire that she has never held a lit match in her life. When those aim and flame things about yay long, you pull a trigger and a little flame shoots out the end, she thought that was proof that God loves her, because now she could light her candles and not have to worry about holding a lit match. Now it's even better, because now they have electric candles and you can turn it on with a remote control. But does my wife's fear of fire interfere with her daily living? No, it doesn't. So pyrophobia, which is the fear of fire, would not be an appropriate diagnosis for my wife, because she lives her life perfectly well, even though she has a fear of fire. And by the way, fear of fire is very common. It's common throughout the world. There are certain things, thunder, snakes, lightning, fire, all of those are very common fears throughout the world. And there may be something evolutionary in that. Now, I'm not talking about tadpoles turning into monkeys. I'm talking about continuing the species. So we probably learned that lightning is dangerous because it causes fires. So we learn to fear lightning because it starts fire, which destroys everything that it comes in contact with. That kind of makes sense in that way. But because my wife is able to live her life without interference, a diagnosis of a phobia would not be appropriate. There are specific types of phobias. Animals, for example. Somebody is afraid of insects or animals. Typically, this happens in childhood because of a traumatic event. A natural environment phobia is fear that's caused by objects in the natural environment, such as a storm, heights, or fear of water. Blood injection is a fear that's started by seeing blood or an injury, receiving an injection or other type of invasive medical procedure. Oftentimes this runs in families, and there's a strong fainting response. People tend to faint when they see blood or they get a shot. A situational phobia is fear that is cued by a specific situation, such as driving through a tunnel or being in an elevator, something like that. And then the fifth category and final category is a catch-all thing that's just other. Now, what would be an other phobia? Well, it's something like choking. Some people are afraid of choking, and that doesn't fit in the animal or the natural environment and so forth. Women have 2 times as many, or let me rephrase that, 2 times as many women as men have phobias, but it varies across the specific phobia. It's greater for some phobias, such as animal and situational. There is an increased risk of phobia in a first-degree relative. Some people have aggregated phobias, and that means they're of the animal type, but different people in the family will have fear of different animals. Social phobia is a specific type of phobia. It's a marked and persistent fear of at least one social or performance situation when there are going to be unfamiliar people or possible scrutiny. The individual fears the social situation, and again, it comes into the form of a panic attack. These people don't want to be evaluated or judged. That's the biggest thing. Now, interestingly enough, public speaking is the #1 social phobia in the United States. 92% of people who have a phobia were severely teased as children. And social phobics are likely to have parents who are also socially isolated and avoidant. So, when we talk about specific phobias, about 12% of people will have them over their lifetime. Animal, dental, blood, and injection phobias tend to begin in childhood. Claustrophobia, fear of being in an enclosed space, typically begins in adolescence or early adulthood. There are some significant psychosocial factors, such as conditioning, a traumatic event. Genetics have something to do with it. But again, treatment is quite simple and very, very effective. Behavior treatment is the best, and in behavior treatment, you're simply exposing the person to the feared event. And you don't just all of a sudden get somebody who's afraid of a snake, throw a snake at them. What you might do is begin to talk about snakes with somebody, and when they become more comfortable with that, you might show them a picture of a snake in a magazine, and then eventually you may even go to a pet store where they sell pet snakes, and in some cases you might even get somebody to actually hold a snake. Now, some of you guys are shuddering out there. I can see it happening right now. But exposure to the feared event or situation when nothing goes wrong is the best treatment for a phobia. Now, virtual reality, the what we've done now with VR, particularly in the goggles and things like that, that has changed the treatment for phobias because now you can virtually expose people to situations and it looks real. I had a pair of virtual reality goggles that we wound up giving to our grandchildren, but when I had them, I mean, we could look in it. Boy, it looked like you're in a canyon or something somewhere. Very realistic, and that virtual reality has really changed the way we treat people with phobias. Now, I'm drawing to a close here, but just for the fun of it, um, I've I told you, you name it, somebody's afraid of it. But I've got a list here of some phobias that I just want to share with you, just to give you a sense of it. So here then is a list of phobias. I think some of them are just fun to say. Cocophobia is the fear of ugliness, whereas Calagenophobia is the fear of beautiful women. Aphibophobia is the fear of teenagers. Um, Arachobutyrophobia, I gotta practice that one. That's the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth. Imagine that. Gamophobia is the fear of marriage. A lot of guys have that. Gatophobia is the fear of cats. My father-in-law had this one. Let me say it again. Gephyrophobia. Gephyrophobia is the fear of crossing a bridge. And he lived here in Hampton, Virginia. That's a horrible phobia to have because in Hampton you can't go anywhere without crossing a bridge. Melissophobia, I think, is my favorite phobia. It is not the fear of girls named Melissa. It is the fear of bees. Nomatophobia is the fear of names. Here's a good one. Omphalophobia is the fear of belly buttons. Penophobia, the fear of everything. Pilodophobia is the fear of bald people. I had this one. Pentherophobia, fear of my mother-in-law. But look at this. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this one. This great big old word right here is the fear of long words. So, you can see it's a serious thing, but some people are afraid of things that really don't need to be afraid of. Barophobia is the fear of gravity. Gravity is what holds us onto the earth. So, but you see, we're talking about mental illness here, and mental illness doesn't have to make sense. Now, I'm kind of poking fun here, but it really is a serious thing. If you have a phobia, there is help. It's effective, and it's easy. Now, you may not think it's easy as you're going through it, but after it's done, I think you would agree with me that getting rid of a phobia is not that big a deal. So, I'm going to leave you with this. Isaiah 41:13 says this, "For I, the Lord your God, will hold your right hand, saying to you, fear not, I will help you." What a promise. God's going to hold our hand and help us whenever we're afraid. And I can't end this without saying this. 2 Timothy 1:7. "For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind." That's the scripture I pray frequently when I pray with people. We don't need to be afraid because God's with us. And He's given us power and love and a sound mind. So that's it for today. Tomorrow will be our last video. I hope to see you then. So go with God. Have a great day. Remember, God loves you, and so do I. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.